And so with us today, we have Lorraine Musinde, who's co-founder and senior compliance consultant. Then we have Osiok Ojior, who's board advisor of RegTech Africa and co-founder and CPO of Covenda. And with us as well, we have our CEO of Global Voice Group, James Claude. So very briefly, I would like Lorraine, in this order, Osiok and James, to do a brief introduction on your position and why your interest in the specific topic we're about to cover. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Clara. So I'm a legal risk and compliance professional. I'm a co-founder of my own RegTech startup in Nairobi, Kenya. And I'm excited to have this session today because we are passionate as RegTech compliance about digital literacy and how we can use technology to just basically make life easier. But most importantly, COVID has threatened the sustainable development agenda. And because of that, we've fallen back when it comes to eliminating extreme poverty globally. And I think domestic revenue mobilization is a key thing that will assist in getting us to a good level and an even better level than we were in pre-COVID era. So I'm keen on having an active discussion, active session, answering questions, and just sharing my insights based on my experience and my interactions.
Thank you so much, Lorraine. Well, I think it's a shared interest among the panelists. I'm sure Osiok as well can bring a lot to the conversation. Please, Osiok, provide us with a small intro so we can get to know you better. Thank you.
Certainly. Thank you, Clara. My name is Osiok Ojior. I'm a board advisor to RegTech Africa, which is essentially a regulatory and technology media company. And like Clara mentioned, I'm also co-founder and chief product officer for Covenda in the UK. Covenda is a cybersecurity RegTech startup that is Africa focused. The topic of domestic revenue mobilization is of immense interest to me. I've been involved in major digital transformation program for the public and private enterprises in Nigeria. That was a bank verification number, which was basically a biometric means of identifying participants in the formal financial system in Nigeria. And as we see the flow of VC funding across Africa, Nigeria's #1 destination, a huge part of that goes into the financial services or fintech industry. And the BVN really is at the core of identifying both the consumers behind whom the opportunities exist in the fintech space. More currently, I'm also involved in another digital transformation exercise that is essentially establishing a biometric-based identification solution for what is essentially Africa's largest community of legal practitioners, that is the Nigerian Bar Association. They recently had their annual general conference in August. And my understanding is it's the largest gathering of lawyers under one roof globally. The ability to identify all these legal practitioners certainly represents a massive drive for revenue mobilization, not only for this community, but for example, if you think about the interactions between lawyers and various sectors of the society, each of these interactions, when they are digitized, also are opportunities for driving revenue mobilization. So these are two areas that really makes it very interesting to me, and I'm happy to speak more about this as we go.
Thank you so much, Osiok, for your introduction. I think we have a better picture of both your expertise in this arena. And finally, James, we leave the floor to you, and maybe followed by this brief introduction before the kickoff of the panel questions. Thank you so much. James, I'm not sure we can hear you.
Sorry, can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yeah, sorry, I think my mic was on mute. Thank you. So thank you, Clara, and thank you to the other fellow panelists for your introduction. So I'm very fortunate to lead a company which value proposition has two main components. First of all, we provide cutting edge technologies to regulatory bodies, especially telecom regulators, revenue authorities, central banks. But at the same time, we work with them to provide revenue assurance solutions so they can optimize their revenue, especially local revenue. So, which is the main topic we'll be discussing. There are many ways government can finance their socio-economic development. But one of the aspects or one of the key stuff that I believe is somehow overlooked or it's considered to be a taboo is whenever they consider to implement some kind of taxes or locally and how they can efficiently mobilize new revenue. So I believe it's a very interesting topic. And I look forward for a fruitful discussion with the fellow panelists. And of course, we welcome questions and interactions from the whole audience who is participating from all over the world. Thank you.
Thank you, James. We are realizing more attendees are joining the session as we speak. So we have done the introductions. Obviously, we will record the session. And for those of you who have missed the first part, we will certainly ensure you receive it. James, if it's okay, we can move forward with the introductory remarks. 1 second, I would share back my screen.
So just to set the context for the discussion, and so we can start with our fellow panelists. I'm gonna have a 5 slides presentation where I'd like to discuss the domestic revenue mobilization. It's a reality that in Africa and in many developing countries, there is a big gap when you consider their tax to GDP ratio. And I think one of the key issues that they face is in most of those countries, a big part of the economy is still informal. So 2 billion people work in the informal economy globally, and 85% of the African populations works in the informal economy. So more than 2/3 of the informal economy is based in sub-Saharan Africa. So that, of course, has an implication in tax collections, in local revenue mobilization. So how can you apply the same type of complex tax system based on VAT that you have in Portugal or in France? You try to apply this where 90% of the economy is formal, and in a country like, I would say, if we take the example of any African countries, where a huge chunk of the economy is more informal. So this is one of the main issues that they face. So we'll discuss what are the solutions or what are the potential solutions that could be used in that context. Next. Yeah, just to give you like a picture of one of the KPIs that is used widely is the tax to GDP ratio to understand how much governments are collecting locally from the economy to complement their national budget. So the tax to GDP ratio, and if you look at it in this graph, you see most of the African countries are well below the 34% that it is happening in OECD countries. So it's but not all the countries are at the same level. You see, it can start in Nigeria, where we're talking about 6% tax to GDP ratio. And there is a real issue there, and compared to Senegal, where they are at 16%, and Africa in general is still at 16.6%. But that's still meaning that there's still room for improvement as a bigger part of the economy is moving toward the more formal economy, and even using the existing infrastructure, leveraging on technologies. We believe there is room for improvement in this area. Next. So now it's clear there is a need for stable sources of revenue in Africa, and it cannot be only based on foreign aid or multilateralism, where of course, there are many of the countries in Africa have natural resources that could be used as collateral for debt and other type of financing. But we believe with the revolution that has been happening in many African countries, with more people are using new type of fintech, and that it's now should be easier for governments to start looking internally and see how innovative financing type of development where they can apply micro levies, they can apply more direct type of taxation. So this way to respond to those different challenges. So domestic revenue mobilization is a key aspect in that, in order to really ensure stable sources of revenue. Of course, the fight, not a fight necessarily, but bringing more people from the informal economy to the formal economy will be very helpful. And the last point, we talk a lot about financial inclusion as an objective as a man, but if more people are financially included, they are using more the banking system, they are using more mobile money, which is widely used in many African countries. There are ways where governments can, ask the citizens to pay their fair share in the transaction, in the whole transactional ecosystem, where they can contribute more, and which in return will increase the tax to GDP and more money for the government to finance important socioeconomic projects. Next. Examples, because one thing I said earlier, in many developed countries in the West, in the US, you have different type of taxation. The most important one is the VAT. In many African countries, VAT is there. I mean, wherever you go, I mean, it's very difficult to collect VAT in, VAT out, complex system. However, we've been seeing a trend, and somehow we've been associated to those initiatives where we provide our technologies to support those governments in this kind of new initiatives, where the government goes after more direct type of taxes, where they apply micro levies on financial transactions, for example. Because if the financial system, the mobile money is booming, this is a sector in the economy that is performing well. Why not applying a small micro levy and generate a lot of revenues that can be used for youth employment, to build infrastructure? So those are examples of, what a few countries in Africa are already doing. And we believe it's an example that others can follow, like Ghana, with 1.75% proposed micro levies. They believe in 5 years that will generate more than $5 billion US. Uganda have applied 0.5% on cash out on mobile money. Say, no, we need to be careful and not applying a huge percentage of this direct type of taxation, but applying 0.5, 0.2, that can be billions of US dollar that can be used to invest in the local economy. So of course, it's not applying any level, because what happened in Lebanon, the government decided to tax the OTT as almost 20%, and then that became a huge issue for the country. So policy is important. Technologies can be really leveraged to help governments. And I think combining all of those can really be helpful to improve local revenue mobilization. So that was my intro. This way, set the scenes for the conversation to be followed. Over to you, Clara. Thank you.
Thank you so much, James, for this brief context. We all believe it's important to understand what the situation is. And as a starting point, we will begin the panel discussion with the following question, which is strictly related to one of the slides we've just seen. So I would like to pose the following question to Oceok. Eventually, Lorraine, James, you're welcome to intervene at any point. So Oceok, having seen this massive tax to GDP ratio gap, and this being a great source of concern for many governments and policymakers, what do you think are the main causes for the existing weaknesses in revenue management across the African continent?
So I think I'll address it in two parts. First, there's the massive population of those on the continent who are financially excluded, right? And let me qualify that by saying that, so there's financial inclusion, right? And that will be the participation in the formal financial, sector, industry, what have you, right? But then there's a massive portion of the population that are economically active, right? Which means there's economic activity, but they're not included in the formal financial sector, right? And one major reason behind that would be around the area of identification, right? To what extent do African economies know all of whom participate in the economy, right? For example, in Nigeria, there's an upcoming initiative to establish new banking notes, right? And part of the thinking behind that is that there's a huge volume of cash, of fiat currency, right? That the central bank says they can't account for, right? Or they don't know where it is, right? And so if a lot of these transactions, these economic activity were financially included, right? Then we would actually strengthen revenue management across the continent. And that's just Nigeria, as we know, as one example. To the issue of identification, the same way there are regulations asking for banks and other kinds of financial institutions to know their customers' KYC, the same thing doesn't really exist, in the continent. The level of, even though many countries have some form or the other of a national identity system, perhaps there's a correlation between the weakness in revenue collection or revenue management, if you will, that one could correlate with the weaknesses in these various national identity systems, right? So, for example, again, Nigeria's population, or if you're looking at, say, maybe Senegal, Kenya, wherever, what is the percentage of the population, right, who are known by the government, right? So, because if I don't know who you are, if I can identify you uniquely, then obviously I'm going to have an impact into, because revenue isn't coming from thin air, right? Revenue is going to be coming from the citizens who we must know. And again, if we don't know them, if these citizens are economically active but financially excluded, that obviously is going to weaken revenue management. The one more obvious one for me, and most also established, would be around the area of just, and this may seem somewhat controversial, but just the rate of poverty in the continent, right? So citizens need to be economically active, need to be well employed, have a high quality of life, have access to great jobs, good income, to have the kind of economic activity that really strengthens revenue management. Now, this is not to suggest that the current state of African economies is not sufficient to have much more robust revenue management and taxation, but this is just also stating the obvious. So if we're thinking about revenue management in Africa, we've got to not think of the same way you would in the Western world, right? Where you have, in many cases, much more high quality of life, income per capita is also much more robust, right? So besides just knowing who our citizens are, biometric identification, financial inclusion, there also is the obvious, what is the level of poverty, right? How much disposable income do the citizens have available for the government to even tax at all?
Thank you. So I've seen Lorraine nod a few times when mentioning about the need for traceability, especially speaking about the need for identification in order to quantify and bring on board to the formal economy all those active.
Yeah, Clara, I was just going to mention to Oshoke and just speak to his comment on poverty, especially because personally, I feel like, and I believe based on the numbers that James has given, 85% of the workforce in developing countries is in the informal sector. And we don't have tax collection mechanisms that suit this category of people. So for example, how are you going to collect from the informal sector if they do not have smartphones and you have digital tax system for collection? So how are you going to enable them in the first place so that you can be able to collect? It's key, especially in line with what Oshoke has just spoken about. But I think a key issue and a key weakness that I see in revenue management across the African continent is the lack of transparency in contracts. I feel as a regulatory professional, I need to highlight the lack of transparency in contracts. I can give an example for Kenya. Unfortunately, we have the standard gauge railway that was contracted by the previous government, and they got into a contract with the Chinese government for the development of the SGR. Up to today, as Kenyans, we do not know the contents of that contract between the Kenyan government and the Chinese government. And this really weakens taxpayers' trust, because they are unable to really see where the money that is being collected is going towards, if they can't visualize it, if they can't see, if they can't experience a change in their lives, stability in work, in jobs, and poverty elimination, then it's very difficult to still keep going back to them and ask for taxes from them. That's just my view when it comes to really looking at the informal sector and customizing specific mechanisms that would boost domestic revenue when you're collecting from that specific category of people, so that it is something that is simple but still efficient, and you're able to meet your goal. That's my view.
Thank you, Lorraine. So trust is indeed one of the challenges. James, I don't know if you want to add anything.
Yeah, just I believe Oseke made a very good point about identity, because this is, I believe, the essential component to successfully build the digital economy, and which can make financial inclusion a reality. And but I'd like to emphasize on what Rowan is saying about like the trust from taxpayers, especially if you are collecting from the informal economy. But now, how do you collect from the informal economy? I think it's still a challenge, and I believe the initiatives that many countries are embarking into, such as let's see a specific sector that is performing well, such as mobile money or the telecom sectors, and where without the need of identifying the people, they can apply a micro levies, let's say 0.5% any time someone makes a cash out. In the case of Uganda, that generates about like 20 million US dollar per year. So one way you can really establish trust is, this is the revenue mobilization component, is to come up in the finance law with a clear revenue utilization. Okay, so we're gonna I know that mobile money is booming, but of course, a lot of vulnerable peoples are using it. Okay, we're gonna put 0.5% on cash out. That will generate 25 million US dollar per year, but we're gonna use this money to build the road between this town to the other one. So there's a clear revenue utilization linked to the specific type of direct taxation, which is, I'm not talking about VAT or talking about other type of complex VAT, but then I'll go back to the VAT in general. I have nothing against VAT, but I believe Africa does better when they innovate in the sense where they don't necessarily apply what is being done in the West, but they apply that to their local realities. So just to close this point, I believe revenue utilization can be a very good point to really incentivize our trust from the taxpayer, especially when you are collecting from the informal economy.
Thank you, James. So we've looked into the reasons why behind this significant problem related to revenue mobilization, and now it's the time to look into what could be done. So, according to the World Bank, we see most African economies have the potential to mobilize more in taxes. So now that we've addressed the core issues related to where these revenues are being designated, the issue related to trust and identification, what solutions do you see could be implemented to solve those challenges? Lorraine, maybe you wanna get started here. If not,
yeah,
we can switch to someone else.
Sure, no problem. I think key for me here is to highlight that, especially in Africa, we have a big issue when it comes to international tax loopholes. So we get most of our multinationals and wealthy individuals driving their revenue to other countries. And mostly they are doing this in order to evade or avoid tax, but it can also be excessive. and it should be checked and it should be monitored. If it is monitored effectively, then you're able to have effective policies and regulations in country that would ensure that most of the revenue that is being generated in country is remaining in country and utilized for good benefit of the people who are being taxed, like for example, for social protection, than for this money to leave the country, go to tax havens, as they call them, and still propagate things like money laundering, fraud, and corruption. So for me, I think closing the international tax loopholes is a big thing that could help to address this. And then, as I said, and I still want to insist on building the taxpayers' trust. To just add on to what James had said in the previous question, I identified 4 drivers that would foster trust, especially taxpayers' trust. And for me, these are fairness, equity, reciprocity, and accountability. If you ensure all 4 are in place, there's equity, there's fairness, there's reciprocity, and there's accountability, then you're able to get transparency, you're able to build that trust, and you're able to grow the African economy.
Thank you, Lorraine. I don't know if there's anything else to add. I think it's quite a comprehensive analysis of.
Yeah, I'd like to add. I think it's trust, the trust aspect, and also the loophole. I understand governments can face a very tough situation when they want to attract investors. They want to increase their foreign direct investments. They tend to really give a lot of advantage for multinationals, and so now let's say Kenya is competing with Uganda and competing with Senegal to attract those investments, and one way they do that is just like by giving those tax exemption. But I think the policies should be linked with some kind of KPIs that are really measurable, and where also the saving should be used to benefit more the local population, to create more local jobs, and so on. So I think that's something that the way you can still attract FDI, but at the same time, there's the benefits to the local population. But going back to your point on how do countries mobilize new resources, I will go back to my previous point is, if you look at today, the VAT system and its complexity, and when you pay something with VAT and then you collect, so VAT in most of African countries represent like 80% of their taxes, and it's so complicated, so complex to navigate through it and to collect. And so I believe there should be a combination of looking at areas where instead of VAT, but you can have more direct type of taxes, such as levies and so on. And I think when I see what South Sudan, one of the newest country in Africa, instead of going with VAT, they went directly to sales tax. Sales tax is it's plain, direct, at any level in the chain within the value supply and the value creation. So the tax is applied direct. So it's easier to collect. So I think in Africa, there should be like a debate about, of course, bringing more people into the formal economy, see how we can apply more direct type of taxes, and also how we can improve the collection of like using like the VAT, or even changing the law to increase other type of resources that are not really linked to VAT, which is very complex to collect.
I want to just add something briefly, right? It just also popped in my mind, and that is, I would look at RegTech, right? So the use of, getting the regulators, the government, essentially, right? Because that's who they are, being more tech enabled, right? I think because if we strengthen tax collection, right, and in a very weak revenue management environment, right, then there'll be a lot of waste, right? And then also think about corruption too, right? So as an African, one of the things you're going to ask yourself when you pay taxes is, what's my money being used for, right? Again, not wanting to be controversial, but this is the reality on the ground. Corruption exists everywhere, but the degree to which you might find that, across a continent is such that you almost need to shred the existing social contract that citizens have with your governments and establish a brand new one, right? Or at least, infuse in that, like Lorenz says, a lot more trust. Because it's a hard sell to say that, especially when we want to collect more from the informal economy, but then you don't see that increased taxation translating into increased infrastructure or support for startups, or increased incomes and jobs and what have you. I just suspect that it's not really going to work, really. However, if we want to establish a lot more transparency, a lot more trust, in addition to saying that we're going to basically revive that social compact that people have with your government, I certainly see a place for where if we can also integrate a lot more technology into these various processes of the government, both of the, not even of the tax collection now, that's a part of it, but what happens after you collect the taxes, right? Can I have, like Lori mentioned about, contact management earlier, can I have a lot more transparency and automation into how we can recognize that my tax has been collected, this revenue, how is it being used, right? That's something that, that pops in my mind as I think as something else that we don't know to that problem.
Thank you, Usiok, for those final comments. There's a common ground here in terms of the final destination of these revenues raised, and it's normal that it's something that raises a lot of questions. This is precisely why we're having this session to narrow them down. And it's a good point you brought at the end about technology. So specifically, the next question is strictly related to it. I would ask you directly how and according to your experience, what's the role of technology and how it is important for essentially sometimes the technical assistance programs towards supporting this DRM. So maybe you want to address this. It was one of your final remarks on the need for this technology.
Sure. So this actually reminds me of a comment my former boss, who is now a deputy governor of the central bank, used to say. He would say, if you bring in technology to automate a bad process, it's still a bad process, right? So we first need a good, clean process that's optimized, that's simple, that makes sense, that's efficient, and then bring in technology. So it's not so much about just simply automating things or introducing technology, right? But it can help once we now have the right contracts or the right agreement in place in terms of how do we want to operate. A specific example I can really just again point out to would be the bank verification number. In Nigeria, Nigeria started to have over 200 million people plus in its population. I definitely the amount of citizens who are now enrolled in the BVN is under 100 million. I believe maybe perhaps around 50 million or thereabout. So right there, we can see the huge gap, right, between those who are in the formal financial sector and those who are not. And upwards of about 80% of those who are not are still economically active. Now, even that 50 million, these identified citizens, that we've got in the financial sector, what's made that possible was first a process that works, right? A process that was domesticated to what is the reality of, individuals, the population in Nigeria, right? Versus even just in Kenya or elsewhere. And then bringing technology into that, right? So in making the process for getting your BVN, your bank verification number for enrolling as simple as possible, having a centralized store of that data. But even though a centralized store, of that data, having multiple collection points across perhaps wherever you have a banking location. That is one way I see technology being able to be brought in to help in that. In this area, again, I must still emphasize RegTech. So, for example, at Covenda, we are in the early stages of working with some regulators who I can't mention yet, who have developed regulation, whose regulation are really focused across, say, for example, again, not to get too specific now, but the entire population. But many times when a regulator is thinking about who a regulation applies to, it'll be focusing on larger enterprises. We've come to the conversation saying, look, let's you have a much larger population of the regulated or those who the regulation applies to who are not your large enterprises, right? These are your micro, small, medium enterprises, and emphasis really on micro and small enterprises when we're talking about Africa, less than, more than medium or large enterprises. So I can go to one large enterprise and it's very easy for me to identify, how my regulation applies to them, apply fines and penalties, and, and obviously that also becomes a source of revenue. For your micro and small enterprises, it's a lot harder because there's just way more of them. They probably won't be as tech savvy, and really not the only way, but one way we're advising regulators that they can now begin to get a handle, or at least to recognize that population, in the economy, is using technology, right? So it's a tech platform. I can create a system whereby it's easy for either through self-enrollment, or to really gather that kind of population of enterprises, to begin to know who they are, right? Because in knowing who they are, again, let's not forget, penalties for non-compliance are also a kind of tax as well. There's still revenue for the government or the regulator. So my mind goes in that direction immediately, that we have a lot more regulators who are using RegTech solutions, again, specific on focus on identifying your small, your micro and small enterprises. That is one quick way why I see how we can use technology to actually assist in revenue mobilization.
I think something I just added, Clara, is I believe revenue mobilization or local domestic tax collection should be part of a comprehensive approach from I would say, a broader vision for the government, because as we've been discussing, digital identity or identity is essential to really identify the taxpayers who are transacting through this type of new economy. We also discuss how do you effectively fight corruption, how do you collect tax using, in many countries they are rolling out this type of machine, so revenue authority can get in real-time tax information. So again, I believe, that increased tax to GDP should be part of a broader goal, broader objective of the government. And just to add, last point on that topic is, I believe many countries at the regulatory level, especially revenue authorities, today there are tools there to stop these in-person auditing of going to the taxpayers and go see how much, show me your books. There are regulatory technologies out there today that could easily be deployed, where all of those information, you can get them in real time. That will save time and they will become more efficient in doing their job in collecting more revenues. And I need to add, I'm very proud to be associated with many of projects like that, where our company have provided to many countries in Africa to become more efficient in tax collection.
Clara, I'll just jump in and add to what Oshoke was speaking about with respect to regulatory technology, especially because I have a bias here since I'm a RegTech professional. We are already doing this in Kenya for the private sector, especially. Just recently, the central bank launched new regulations governing the digital lenders in the country. And they've had to embrace technology in order to comply, especially in this post-COVID era. So this is something that should be taken critically in terms of just ensuring that the compliance risk is mitigated and the efficiency is there. And as James says, you have an audit trail when you use a system. So you're able to hold people accountable and the exact person while at that, yeah.
Thank you for those additional remarks, Lorraine. Actually, you've all provided a few examples already. The next question is mostly covered, but I'm sure there's something else we can add. We're looking into any specific examples of these developments and how according to your experience, this has had a dramatic or not so dramatic, perhaps, impact on improvement on boosting tax collection. I believe also has mentioned an example in Nigeria. You've mentioned the Central Bank of Kenya. Lorraine, I don't know, perhaps James or Lorraine yourself.
Yeah, I can start with this one. Just I'll give the example of Ghana, because this is a project we have been quite close to it, is the e-levy. The government decided with their current finance law to implement the initial idea was 1.75% on all financial transactions, mainly targeting the mobile money ecosystem. Just to give you an idea, 4/5 of Ghanaian economy transact through mobile money, and 4/5 of the GDP of Ghanaian economy. So there have been a lot of debates about this topic, but one key element that they added in this tax was if you spend, or the first equivalent in $12 per day you spend, you are exempted of this tax. Now, let's say that I have a mobile money account. How can you track if you spend, let's say, $10 now, and then you go on another network, you send another 10 US, so only 8, which is the difference between the 20 and 12 that is taxable. How do you try that? And I think we are part of this process where we help them to figure out, by putting in place a central system linked to the common platform that we have provided to them, where they are able to, in real time, track all the identities of everyone transacting in the mobile money ecosystem. And just to give you an idea, we're talking about more than $1 billion per year that will generate for the country. So that's an example where a regulatory body working directly with the authority, working directly under the guidance of the Minister of Finance, leveraging on the telecom regulator and working with RegTech provider such as us. So they are able to really pull something like that. And of course, we're gonna wait to the end of the year to see the results. Those are examples that other countries can follow. And also, it also addressed one of the points that Osyok mentioned at the beginning, the needs for identification. And identification, just to add on the last point, is I believe in many countries where we have a weak identification system, if you look at the penetration of mobile money, where there's a clear regulation making it mandatory for the mobile operators to identify their subscribers, there is a kind of partnership or leverage that can happen between government and those private service providers in order to fast track identification. And that's exactly what Ghana is doing. That's exactly how this e-levy could be implemented and to become a success.
2 examples from me, Clara. I'll start with Kenya. So the Kenya Revenue Authority became fully digitized in 2016. They launched their iTax system, and it provides real-time updates of tax accounts and also a platform to file returns. And right after launching this iTax system in 2017, they launched it in 2016, and in 2017 financial year, they collected 1.3 trillion Kenya shillings in taxes, which was an added 115 billion compared to the previous year before digitizing. So this is intrinsic facts that can tell us that if you digitize, then you stand to collect more. But over and above that, they also launched a mobile phone tax application in 2020. And now every registered taxpayer is able to look at their tax profile and see how they're doing just from the click of a button on their phone. My second example is Thailand. They launched in 2020 a mobile app that allows tourists to claim tax refunds, their VAT refunds when they're leaving the country through the mobile app. I don't know if it's just my experience, but previously when I've traveled internationally, every time I failed to claim tax refunds for VAT just by seeing the queue and how long it is in the airport, especially with the hassle of travel. I think this is something that simplifies collection and makes it easy to file returns and to get things going. So just embracing technology has its benefits.
So something I'd just like to point out, right, I was just running through my head as I was listening to Lorraine and James speak, is the idea that not an idea, right? So just want to clarify that technological development does not necessarily equate into improved tax collection, right? Or even in improved efficiencies. I recognize that we're trying to identify specific examples where the tech development led to or boosted tax collection. I get that.
Yeah.
But there's also the case of where I think we also should be thinking about how can technology be used to, in the first place, optimize existing regulatory processes, right? So that when they do then start taxing or revenue collection, you do get the net benefit that that we expect. There are many examples of government projects, right, that are crazily expensive, tech related, and like you mentioned about KPIs later on. When you then begin to measure the impact, you struggle to find how the technological development, right, really has led to any net societal gain, if you will. It's not to say that we don't need to do these things, but it's just to put out there that because especially in in these parts, in Africa, there's this often drive to say, let's get the next, the best, and the greatest. I sometimes argue, for example, the rate of smartphone usage in the continent doesn't correlate with the level of people being smart about their phones, right? And so for me, it sometimes is a struggle whether is the gap, is the need more technological development, or is it first development in terms of the process, how we want to operate, how we want to collect tax, why we will collect tax, what the tax will be used for, and then we bring in technology into that. But nonetheless, again, like I said, James, I was just running my head when I heard both of you speaking. The one obvious example I would pop out would be if we look again, the rise of fintechs in Nigeria and even across the continent. You can literally draw. I mean, if you look at the map of Africa and you look at the flow of VC funding, and a lot of times a huge part of that is from fintech, right? That can clearly show a strong correlation between advancements in technology development, in improving taxation, because all these massive fintechs, and their crazy revenues are all contributing, in forms of taxes back to the economy.
Yeah, I mean, I think I agree with you, because I mean, what I believe is tax increase or tax collection increase can be a consequence of many other things that have to be in place, such as having these increasing socioeconomic development overall, properly identify people, investment in infrastructure, investment in literacy, bringing more people into this digital economy where there is traceability and so on. All of that and financial inclusions, all of that will help in improving tax GDP. So, but I believe technologies, not always, but most of the time, if used to support efficient process, can really save time, can really make the whole process become even more efficient.
Yes. Now that we've reached a consensus over this question, which it's interesting because Oseok seems to skip to the next question every time we answer, because we're talking about the challenges, and obviously the process is a challenge before the technological implementation is put in place. So I think it was a good end to the prior question, and a good kick off for the next one. You've cited a few of them already, but maybe there are some other challenges, especially related to the regulatory framework, the existing regulatory framework. This is a question that can be interesting, so I leave the floor to you, Oseok, if you want to kick off with this question.
Definitely, it reminds me of a TED talk, I think from either 4 or 5 years ago, by Afoso Ojomo. I believe he was doing his research at Harvard, and he talked about the poverty paradox. right? How in Africa, the approach to how we alleviate poverty tends to be around infrastructure, right? So let's build more wells, let's have more roads, let's have more telephone lines, or what have you, and not about innovation. But in this study, when he looked at other countries where they had made that move from being a low developed economy to a highly developed economy, there's a lot more innovation. So what jumps in my mind, and again, that's a talk from a while back, but it comes to my mind right away, because that's something I've been thinking about. What our challenge is, right? There seems to be too much focus on infrastructure, right? And many times, how do we deploy this existing solution or this existing technology from somewhere else, into one African country? And most times they actually don't work when we actually go back and measure the social impact, the economic impact. It works for the providers of these solutions, right? It works for the person who gets a contract or the tenderpreneur in between, who gets a deal off of that contract. And so that heavy focus on infrastructure as opposed to innovation, is what I see to be one of the huge challenges. And again, the reason why that is a challenge, because like James alluded to earlier, we need to be thinking about, I hate to think that Africa is such a unique place, but it really is, right? I don't think that tech built for Nigeria would necessarily work in the US, right? Or tech built for the Zambia would work in France. And so similarly, why do we think we can just take this existing tech infrastructure and deploy it, in an African country and it will just work as is? Whereas if we're thinking in terms of innovation as opposed to infrastructure, innovation is saying, let's look at the problem that we have on ground, right? The nature of the problem of tax collection, in Nigeria could be wildly different than it would be in Egypt or in Morocco or in Tunisia, right? One example I'm very familiar with is the nature of fraud, right? There were, fantastic fraud solutions brought from the West into African banks that just failed because the nature of fraud transactions, the nature of payment transactions, right, are heavily influenced by culture, right? So in an innovative mindset, as opposed to an infrastructure mindset, what we would do is say, well, what is the problem? And how do we solve for that, right? And so I'm looking at the problem in a specific locality or domain and solving for that. And to do that, one has to be thinking innovatively, as opposed to just taking some existing infrastructure and deploying that.
Thank you, Lorraine. I don't know if from a regulatory framework standpoint, do you have any additions to Osiok's remarks?
Yes. So just as he said, the main issue is to get a customized solution for a customized problem than getting a generalized solution to address a problem that is unique to you. So when it comes to regulations, it also works that way. Regulations are customized based on culture, practices, and everything that the regulator would want to achieve in a particular industry based on the observations that they've, for example, made with respect to incidents occurring in a particular space, how the consumer is being treated, how data is being handled, is it protected, and things like that. So based on that, then regulations are created, and it's very difficult to have technological development that is addressing specific regulatory challenges without zeroing in on one specific sector and doing gap analysis and identifying exactly what the issue is that needs to be addressed and what's the best way to address it. Just to add to what Oshoke was saying, when it comes to the challenge with regulatory technology and technology in general, not meaning that when you have technology, it results in direct revenue collection. It's true. I think the biggest challenge towards technological implementation is the lack of skills, digital skills, to even utilize tax systems. So you need specialized skills to be able to utilize. You need, for example, a laptop, a personal computer, or a smartphone. If you don't have it, then how are you going to be able to run with the government agenda of collecting the tax? So yes, when it comes to regulations also, we've had the age-old issue where the technology is advancing at a faster rate than the regulation. And so we have delayed government decisions we have delayed regulation, we have delayed policies, and this means that as you're innovating and you're building, for example, a solution that would address a problem, the regulations are not in tandem with that solution. And that's the biggest regulatory gap in my view, to just ensure that you bring in the entire ecosystem, bring in regulators, bring in the regulated entities and individuals, and try and come up with strategies that you can both align with and work towards to ensure that there are no differences when it comes to implementation.
Thank you, Lorraine. James, before we go to the last question, I don't know if you have any.
I will say very quickly on the innovation side, and innovation should be quite broad. Not only the fintech or the different sectors or the service providers have to be innovative, but I think the authorities as well, the governments or the revenue authorities. And United Nations came up with this concept of innovative financing for development, which consists in identifying key sectors in the economy which is performing well, and applying a very simple micro levy on the transaction, on the volume of transactions that they have that can yield in huge revenues, and search for key purpose where this revenue can be utilized. So I believe those are the kind of things that in Africa we should look at, because if you look at M-Pesa, that is innovation from Africa, and that serves very well the African continent. Why should we all in Africa, because in the West they have VAT or they have this type of taxes very adapted for formal economy, while we're still having 85% of the economy which is informal? Why should we believe that should be the case? So I think in Africa also we have to be more innovative in that front as well.
Thank you, James. That would lead us to our last question. So before we run through the audience's questions. So how do you see the future of Africa's domestic revenue mobilization, and having gone through all these difficult challenges that seem to be challenging the path towards this improved revenue mobilization? What in your view needs to change for the government's capabilities to improve? So what would be your recommendations? A final state. Lorraine, maybe you want to start on this.
Yeah. So I'll start with the future of Africa's domestic revenue mobilization. I feel like we need an Africa that is able to implement open government reforms, such as open contracting, to try and avoid issues of lack of transparency in contracting, independent auditing, so that we are able to bring in an independent party to check, to audit who audits the tax collector. They may come and claim that they've collected X amount, but who really checks that they've collected X amount and they've done it according to what the law says, the processes, the policies, and all that. So that's one way I see Africa really improving, by implementing open government reforms. And there are some countries that are already in open government partnerships in Africa, so that's a win. At the very least, we have Burkina Faso having open government partnerships. Kenya, we also have South Africa, Liberia, and Sierra Leone. They have open government partnerships. This enables and encourages open data and benchmarking in both private and public sectors. And you're able to now finance your development agenda through the revenue that you have collected. But just by having that openness, sharing information, challenges, trying to come up and troubleshoot root causes and how you can customize specific solutions to address the problem is a key thing, so that Africa is able to finance its development agenda. Then the second bit, when it comes to the change that the government, what needs to change so that government capabilities improve, for me, the biggest thing I would say is to just move away from legacy ways of work. We are in 2022. You simply cannot tell me to bring a physical paper in the form of a tax return for you to be able to revert to me, to bring it to you physically, move from my home, which may be miles away, come and bring it to you so that you can say you've collected tax, and still I go back home and I don't see where the tax has gone. Health-wise, I can't access healthcare. The roads, the infrastructure are poor. My quality of life is generally poor. So for me, I feel like just we need to change our mindsets and move away from legacy ways of work and try and just embrace new ways of work and how best to maximize them so that we can be able to have the capability to improve domestic revenue, mobilization. And most importantly, most of these government agencies and tax authorities have strategies that are just on paper strategies and are not really implemented practically. No one holds them accountable. No one aligns their strategy to their strategy. So with that, it's very difficult to work towards a common goal if there's that dysfunction and confusion. Those are the ways I feel governments can improve their capabilities.
Thank you, Lorraine. James Osiok.
Yeah, I think very quickly, so we can leave room for the audience to participate. I believe there needs to be a change in the mindset. It's already happening, where governments are trying to do things differently. Technology is not the solution to every single problem. Of course, you can leverage on technologies to help, as Osiok has mentioned several times, like efficient process. And I believe governments should be innovative as looking at different ways of doing things in Africa and proper way to collect tax that is appropriate to the local realities. So, and I think even the whole tax system should also be reviewed in light to the African realities. Also, that's something very important.
So what came to my mind right away was a digital transformation, except that given this context, it would sound like it's about technology, and I actually think it's not. I think digital transformation is really more about people and talent and much less about technology. Because at the end of the day, it is people that are going to create, that are going to innovate technology. It's people that are going to use technology. There's this saying that strategy, that culture would always eat strategy for lunch, right? So I think we have a mindset problem, right? And when you think about how we transform that mindset. So I think what's really going to contribute to improving government capabilities is first resetting the expectation, right? Or the agreement, that social contract between governments and their citizens, right? First of all, even having a proper definition of who are citizens versus just people who just exist, right? Do the government see the people as citizens or just as inhabitants of a place? And I really don't mean to be, to sound in any way that's controversial, except that this is the very reality, right? That is why we have this problem in the continent. This is why you can bring in very advanced technology into, even places like South Africa, and they fall flat, right? So yes, I do think that what the government needs to do to improve the capabilities is a digital transformation, but not about technology first. That's one like the 10th thing, right? We need to first of all establish, the people, the talent that exists, and who is a citizen, who is not, and then what are we agreeing with our citizens? So even just saying that right now makes me feel somewhat defeatist because it sounds like a really tall order. It's like, okay, well, I guess you're saying we can't do this. Except there's no point attempting to deal with a problem if you're not going to deal with the root cause of the problem, right? So again, that's just not to leave on a heavy note, but that's really what comes to my mind in terms of how do we improve government's capabilities.
Thank you. I think there's been quite a variety of answers to this one, which is really enriching because that's the whole purpose of this discussion. I think now we can move forward with a few questions from the audience. So we're going to briefly run through them. Some of them are directly addressed to the panelists, so I'll just briefly go through them. One of the questions is addressed at James, the first of them. So does taxation on data and call rates constitute mobile money taxation? It's a very specific one.
Sorry, can you repeat that?
Yes, of course. So the question is, does taxation on data and call rates constitute mobile money taxation? This comes from One Day.
On there's taxation on mobile money and call rate.
Yes, he's asking if the taxation on data and call rates, I understand it's incoming calls.
The VAT you pay.
Yes.
Yeah, exactly. So I think it's important that whenever government thinks about this type of micro levies or taxation on specific transactions, they need to look at that from globally, okay? Because what we want to avoid is double taxation. You tax the person when it buys the bundle that includes data, and then you tax the data, or you add a levy on the data. So that's why in our case, when we advise government, we look at all the tax regime that exists in the telco sector and the fintech sector. So we advise them properly. But at the end of the day, sometimes they make their decisions. In certain cases, the following year in the finance law, they revise that. But I believe you cannot tax, let's say, the mobile data, and then whenever someone buys a bundle that includes data using mobile money, it's being taxed again. So those are the type of things that in the application of the law should be taken into account.
Thank you. Thank you, James. The next question comes from Octavius Cajilla. He asks how much potential tax revenues, so VAT plus income tax, is Africa losing from the global digital economy players? And he mentions Google, Uber, Amazon, Facebook. Any insights on way forward?
Yeah, I'll take that, Clara. So I'll just specifically answer on Google in 2021, Sub-Saharan Africa only, that section of Africa, 12 countries lost 2.8 billion to Google in terms of the revenue that they should have made without the big tech company being a player in the country.
Wow.
Yeah. Just to add on that, I think it's where the strategy should come. If one single country in Africa start to force one of those players to go and pay tax in the service being provided within the specific border, that might not work. So that's why it's very important where you have a regional strategy, or you have like Pan-African strategy, where together, the same way it happened, GDPR is a success in Europe because 28 countries decided this is the way that you can access the single market of 500 million people. So, okay, I think in Africa, this is something maybe we can follow and adapt to our reality, where we can come up together as a single block and try to really tell them, listen, this is a growing market. This is a 1 billion people market in 2030. What do you want to risk, and why don't you come and pay your fair taxes in these countries to foster our development?
Yeah, just to add to that, James, we have the Organization of African Revenue Authorities that came together and decided that they are going to introduce digital tax. So we've been seeing digital tax being introduced in various jurisdictions in Africa to try and still tax the big tech companies and still keep most of the revenue in country. But this is work in progress. The reception of digital tax by the mobile money players and the telco players, as well as investors, was not so good. We had a lot of pushback, especially in Kenya. They tried to introduce it twice now, in the finance bill of 2020 and in the finance bill of 2021. But eventually, digital tax is currently in operation here in the country. And I believe that they came together as the revenue authorities and decided on this to see if they can have a unified approach to keep the revenue domestic.
Yeah,
so I love that idea.
Encouraging.
Sorry, James. I love that idea, but I'll be careful to not want to suggest that African governments begin to tax innovation. They'd love to do that, right? That would simply just stifle innovation. The reasons why the Google, Facebook, Uber, Amazon are so successful in Africa is because they're solving African problems. that also happen to be global problems too as well, right? So, if Africa wants to think of itself like the EU, that probably is not a way forward because it is not the EU, right? It has very different problems, very different social contract with its population, right? And your citizens also expect very different things, right? So, yes, GDPR was a great idea. And maybe you need something like that, in Africa, Nigeria, and a few other countries have come up with their own data protection guidelines. But to simply copy and paste would not be the way to go, because whereas in these economies, their focus, for example, like in the EU, is how do we create a level playing field, right? Recently, we've seen where they talked about even wanting to regulate that the big text, big messaging platforms should allow interoperability with local messaging platforms. In Africa, our focus cannot be about that. It needs to be about growth, right? Because we're nowhere at the level of either healthcare, income, or education, which are the 3 indices for the Human Development Index, for us to begin to say that we want to do like a GDPR anywhere in Africa at all. It would look great on paper, great photo op. It will be meaningless to the socioeconomic impact on people. I think rather that focus needs to be on to say, okay, so what's happening domestically? What are these what are these big tech firms solving for? How do we encourage them to hire more Africans and create more jobs for Africans? Again, so just the very idea of taxing innovation for me just seems to be antithetical to what Africa needs in terms of economic growth.
Sorry, let's go.
Go for it.
Okay, I was just saying there needs to be a balance between regulation and innovation, because unchecked innovation has had dire effects in the past to the people, to the economy as well. So it's just trying to find a balance between where do we come in when it comes to like coming up with policy, with regulation, and at the same time trying to encourage innovation, as you say. This is what I was referencing when I was speaking of open government partnerships. The Kenyan government, our new president, is not even done with his 100 days in office, but he already met the Google Africa CEO, and he's saying, I'm willing to work with Google. I'm willing to see how we can best achieve both our goals together. So it's trying to find that balance, but still not go unchecked just because we are pursuing innovation, because we've seen very negative impacts of just letting techies do what they want.
Yeah, I mean, I'm more with you, Lauren, on this. And okay, listen, I don't mean to tax innovation. I mean, of course not. All I'm saying is if Google is agreeing to pay to France, to Spain, to all of those countries, taxes for services rendered within this country, why shouldn't do the same for services provided to the Kenyan citizens and pay the tax locally? Because now they are agreeing now, Biden administrations and the European Union, there is an agreement now that all good players will be paying. It's only fair to pay taxes for services being provided within this specific territory. So now, again, I believe the approach that Kenya is adopting, it makes sense, where you try to balance it just to make sure, listen, we're not here to overtax you, just asking you to be fair. And then so this way we can use this money to foster even the development of our countries. So that's my take.
Thank you. There are a few more questions. Unfortunately, we're running a little bit late, so we're gonna go with the last one. And it's as follows. Regarding domestic revenue mobilization, much has not been discussed about the identity gap that is related to the informal economy. How do you address identity gap as part of the DRM efforts? Any thoughts on this one?
That's a very good one. And I think I'll leave the floor to Osoke because he's the one who mentioned identity as one of the many issues to be solved. And I agree with him.
Sure, yeah.
Yeah.
No, this is one area where you want to dive right into technology, right? So use of mobile technology for identification. There's a lot more digital penetration than there is financial inclusion. A lot more smartphones, or even just phone usage, at all. So I'm aware of some solutions out there that are looking at using mobile technology for enrollment, for biometric identification. India tried something that was really massive, very successful. That's certainly one way to go. But before that, perhaps it's to say the existing initiatives in countries for identification need to first be implemented. And if you look at every African country's existing initiative for identifying its citizens, the problem is not technology. The problem probably is that, someone has a contract to do something and it's not being used for that, right? Or there are all the cultural or socioeconomic challenges being faced. But again, if you solve for all these things, yeah, I mean, this is one clear place where I would say definitely technology, and has to be mobile, just because of the vastness of the continent.
Yeah, I was just about to also speak about digital identification. Most governments are embracing digital IDs, such so that you're able to have a database of your citizens and you're able to have all the information with just one number, one document that somebody has been issued with. Most, like Singapore starts to do this for young people. When they turn 18, you get your card and you're able to have it as your digital identification card for the rest of your life. But in Africa, we have a problem where you have your birth certificate, you have your identification card, you have your Kenya Revenue Authority PIN certificate. And so KYC becomes a headache. Literally, everybody is having a problem to just even embrace financial products because of the amount of information that you would be requested to give just to identify yourself. So having one source of identification per citizen would help. And Oshoke, unfortunately, the digital ID would work in this case, as you say, from a technological perspective.
Yeah, I just wanted to add on top of that, the benefits of digital ID is not only about mobilizing new revenues or taxes. It also can help government to better serve their citizens. Okay, so when I'm identified, I can access governmental services through my identity. I can sign a document. I don't want to go and pay, let's say, 2,000 shilling to go to a place just to request for a new passport. I can do that online and use my mobile ID to sign, to authenticate, so they can know that I'm the person requesting for this document, and it's easier and smoother. So that's also another advantage that. And by having that in place, more people are benefiting from government services, and more people are also enrolling into the digital economy, and your tax base is also broadening.
Thank you. There's a few more questions. Perhaps it would be a good idea that we could answer them through a mail thread among the panelists. I'm sure we can provide perhaps more in-depth answers for the purpose. So thank you for the questions, and we will address them. Just to end the session, because a lot has been said, I don't know if each of you want to close with a few final conclusions before we leave, and so we can provide a wrap up for the session.
Just to thank Global Voice Group for setting this up. This conversation has been exciting, and I've learned a lot as well in the discussion. But I just want to leave everybody with the 4 drivers that would foster taxpayer trust again: fairness, equity, reciprocity, and accountability. If we can achieve that, then we can achieve taxpayers' trust, and we can achieve domestic revenue mobilization. Thank you.
Yeah, and I'll close to say is I really enjoyed the conversation. I am first and foremost, a tech enthusiast and professional, so don't mean to indicate that I'm not. Just that I've also had the opportunity of seeing Africa from different lenses, right? Both as an African in Africa, and as an African in the diaspora, which is where I've spent most of my time. And so, I'm always happy to be part of these conversations and bringing these various perspectives into when we look at African problems, in continent, outside continent. This is very interesting. Thanks so much.
Yeah, I'd like to thank you both, Lauren and Oshoke, to join this conversation. It was very exciting. And I believe this is the kind of conversation we should maintain and continue to be having, because this way we can discuss from different angles. And I think that's quite enrich the conversation. And I believe Africa has huge potential in terms of increase their efficiency when it comes to tax, but that should be just one component of a broader vision where the socioeconomic development that includes different pillars such as identity, such as literacy, such as financial inclusion, all of that would ultimately contribute to increase tax to GDP ratio, so government can have more money to invest within the local economy. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And thank you all for joining. A really nice afternoon. Thank you, Lorraine. Thank you.
Thank you.
Oseo.
Thank you.
Thank you.